Thank you for listening to our audiobook channel. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new book releases each week. And now, for the feature presentation, The Lotus Curse. Chapter 1. The Curse at the Cairo Museum. The air in Cairo hung with a golden haze as the sun dipped below the domes and minarets, casting long shadows across the sandstone streets. In the distance, the faint sound of a flute drifted from the bazaar, and the scent of jasmine mingled with dust and spice. But within the grand halls of the newly opened Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, the air was distinctly cooler, both in temperature and temperament. It was an evening of celebration. Chandeliers flickered over polished marble floors, and society's finest had gathered in their silks and tuxedos to witness the unveiling of a long-hidden treasure, the papyrus of the Blue Lotus, rumoured to date back to the 18th dynasty and steeped in superstition. Jane Parsons, dressed in an elegant lilac gown with a single amethyst pin at her throat, sipped at a glass of mint tea as she watched the guests mingle. She was not here on business. Her trip to Egypt was meant to be a brief reprieve, an escape from the grey drizzle of London and the endless line of discreet inquiries that passed through her office. A vacation, she had told herself. Sun, culture, perhaps a camel or two. But fate, it seemed, had packed her suitcase with other plans. "Darling Jane," came the familiar drawl of Lady Helena Alverley, sweeping toward her like a silk-clad sandstorm. "You must come. The papyrus is about to be revealed, and you'll never guess who's already fainted from the heat." Jane raised a brow. "Surely not your husband?" "Worse, Lord Greystoke, sprawled by the sarcophagus like Cleopatra's pet, caused quite a scene." Jane chuckled as she followed Helena toward the grand exhibition chamber. The walls were lined with golden statues and painted panels. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy of embroidered linen, stood a tall glass case draped in a deep blue cloth. The crowd murmured with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," intoned Professor Edwin Rathbone, the museum's director, standing at a podium with the gravity of a high priest. "Tonight we bear witness to a relic lost to time, the papyrus of the Blue Lotus, uncovered near Luxor, preserved with astonishing care and entrusted to our stewardship, shall now see the light once more." With a dramatic sweep, the cloth was pulled aside. The guests leaned forward. The papyrus was exquisite. Framed in gold and mounted against velvet, its ink had faded to the brown of old tea leaves, but the artwork remained stunning, a procession of figures offering lotus blossoms to an enthroned goddess. Hieroglyphs adorned its border. And then came the whisper no one expected. "The lotus sees all," murmured a voice behind Jane. She turned just in time to see Lord William Alverley, red-faced and trembling, clutch his chest. He staggered, gasped once, and crumpled to the floor with a thud that echoed through the marble hall. A scream cut the air, glass shattered, the crowd surged backward. Jane was already kneeling beside him, fingers at his wrist, eyes scanning the perspiration beading on his brow. "Get a doctor," she said sharply, "and clear some space. He's still breathing." Helena knelt beside her husband, face drained of colour. "Is it his heart?" she whispered. "He's had episodes, but never like this." "He said something," Jane replied, glancing around. "Did anyone hear it?" "He said something about the lotus," muttered Dr. Neville Quinn, a bespectacled British scholar who had been standing nearby. "A warning, perhaps. Nonsense, of course. Old men and curses." But Jane was frowning, not at the papyrus, not at Lord Alverley, but at the small slip of paper that had fallen from his pocket and fluttered near her shoe. She picked it up. It was part of an old museum pass, torn, aged, and on its back was scribbled a single symbol in black ink, a lotus. Later that evening, with Lord Alverley resting, Jane sat on the veranda of the Shepherd's Hotel, gazing out at the Nile in the moonlight. She had traded her gown for a linen robe and held a glass of something considerably stronger than mint tea. She flipped the scrap of paper over once more. The lotus was unmistakable, but more than that, she recognized the style of the hand. A symbol drawn by someone familiar with hieroglyphics, but not a native. British, perhaps, or European. "Miss Parsons," came a soft voice. She turned to see Helena, pale and flustered, standing at the threshold. "I wouldn't come to you unless it was truly urgent," Helena said. "But something's wrong. William's condition is worse, and the papyrus." Jane rose. "What about it?" Helena's eyes flicked about. "It's gone." Chapter 2. Palm Shadows and Stolen Secrets. The next morning, Cairo wore a different face. The rising sun gilded the city in hues of copper and ochre, and the muezzin's call to prayer echoed from mosque towers. Jane sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, legs crossed, a notepad on her lap, and a half-drunk cup of Turkish coffee on the table beside her. Across from her, Lady Helena Alverley paced the length of the sitting room, clutching a lace handkerchief with increasingly aggressive flourishes. Her ivory morning robe, cinched tightly around her waist, billowed slightly as she turned. "Gone, Jane, simply vanished," Helena said, voice pitched with distress. "They brought it in under lock and key, and now it's disappeared like smoke." Jane scribbled something in her notebook. "Was there a guard stationed overnight?" "Two, actually, Egyptian fellows, polite, professional, but now one of them is claiming he saw a man enter the chamber after midnight. Tall, European, wearing a staff badge. No one else saw a thing." "Convenient," Jane murmured, rising and stepping to the open window. "And Lord Alverley?" "Still unconscious. The doctors say it wasn't his heart, precisely, but something like a seizure. He was delirious before he collapsed, muttering about betrayal and—" Her voice dropped to a hush. "About the goddess Sekhmet judging him?" Jane turned back, her eyes sharp. "So we have a vanished relic, a man stricken by some mysterious ailment, and now a sighting of an unidentified figure with access to museum credentials." And, Helena added with a flare of drama, "a rumour spreading like wildfire that the papyrus was cursed." "Of course it is," Jane muttered dryly. Later that morning, Jane made her way through the bustling streets to the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. The streets of Cairo were alive with colour, dates spilling from market stalls, donkeys laden with linen bolts, and the air rich with the scent of cardamom and incense. But inside the museum, a chill had descended. Professor Edwin Rathbone, the museum director, stood in his office with the rigid demeanour of a man holding back a tempest. A silver-haired Englishman in a rumpled linen suit, he peered over his pince-nez glasses at Jane with an air of restrained scepticism. "I appreciate your interest, Miss Parsons," he said cautiously, "but this is a matter for the local authorities and the museum board. I've been asked to look into this privately by Lady Alverley. As you might imagine, the disappearance of a priceless artifact under British patronage is not something she wishes shouted from Cairo rooftops," said Jane with a cold smile. Rathbone sighed. "Quite. It's a blasted mess, I admit. The Blue Lotus papyrus was meant to be the crown jewel of our new exhibit. It was in its case at 10 p.m. last night. And the guards? One has vanished. The other, Hamdi Saad, is saying strange things, ramblings about the Eye of Horus watching him, and voices from the walls. Madness." Jane arched a brow. "May I speak with him?" Rathbone gestured toward the courtyard. "He's in the guard quarters. Good luck making sense of him." The guard Hamdi sat beneath a dusty awning in the museum courtyard, fanning himself with a rolled newspaper. He looked up as Jane approached, his eyes wide and unfocused. "You are the English investigator?" he asked in heavily accented but clear English. "Yes," Jane said, sitting beside him. "Tell me what you saw." He looked around quickly, as though afraid of being overheard. "It was late, the moon was full, I was on the west wing. The other guard, Karim, left early, said he had a stomach sickness." He swallowed. Then the lights flickered. I saw a man walking past the statue of Anubis. Tall, white man. He wore a staff pass, but I did not recognize him. He moved strangely, like a man in a trance. Jane leaned forward. "Did you follow him?" Hamdi shook his head, trembling. "I was afraid. He turned and looked at me, but his eyes, they glowed, I swear it, like two pieces of burning coal." Jane blinked. "Did you drink anything that evening?" "Only water and mint tea." He paused. "But I smelled something sweet, like lotus. The scent, it filled the corridor." That afternoon, Jane returned to the museum's West Wing corridor. The case that once held the papyrus now stood empty, the velvet backing still bearing the faint rectangular impression of the artifact. The only clue was a thin smear of pale blue powder on the edge of the pedestal. She dipped a gloved finger into it, rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, and brought it close to her nose. "Jasmine," she murmured. "No, lotus." Behind her, a voice interrupted. "You have a nose for perfumes, Miss Parsons." She turned to find a man leaning casually against the wall. Tall, tanned, with unruly blonde curls and an impish grin. He was dressed in khaki trousers and a cream shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a satchel slung across his chest. "Miles Everley," he said, extending a hand. "Archaeologist, linguist, occasional rogue." Jane took his hand with a firm shake. "Jane Parsons, private investigator, occasional tourist." "Well then, perhaps we'll get along after all." "I doubt it," she said, but her smile betrayed her amusement. Miles gestured toward the empty case. "Rumour has it you're sniffing around our little mystery. Care to share what you've uncovered?" "Only that someone went to great lengths to steal an ancient scroll and scare off any witnesses using local superstition." "Ah, yes, the Blue Lotus curse," Miles said, his tone mockingly dramatic. "Every expedition needs one. Wouldn't be Egypt without it." Jane looked at him sharply. "And where were you last night, Mr. Everley?" He chuckled. "I was here, presenting a lecture to a group of snoring Oxford retirees. You can ask the museum staff, but more importantly—" He leaned closer, eyes twinkling. "You should meet our friend Dr. Esteban Carvalho, Spanish scholar. He was one of the last people to examine the papyrus. Rumour is, he knew more about it than he let on." "And where is he now?" "Vanished," Miles said with a shrug. "Supposed to return to Spain 3 days ago, never boarded the boat, left his luggage at the docks." That night, Jane sat alone on her hotel balcony, notebook in hand, the air scented faintly with lotus blossoms drifting from the garden below. The papyrus was gone. One guard missing. One archaeologist vanished. One nobleman poisoned or cursed. And a scent that lingered like a whispered warning. She would need to dig carefully. In Egypt, even the dead had their secrets. Chapter 3. A sip of lemon tea and a hint of lies. The garden of the Alvely Villa in Garden City, a wealthy district nestled between the Nile and Cairo's bustling heart, was a fragrant oasis of calm. Date palms cast slow-moving shadows over mosaic-tiled walkways, and fountains gurgled softly into lily-laced pools. But beneath the serene surface of this English expat residence in Egypt, something had soured. Jane Parsons, dressed in a pale linen blouse and a wide-brimmed hat pinned with a sprig of lavender, sat in a wicker armchair beneath a canopy of bougainvillea. Her hostess, Lady Helena Alverley, sat opposite her at the garden table, struggling to pour tea without visibly trembling. "I'm so terribly sorry about the lemon," Helena said, as a limp slice slid off the edge of the porcelain saucer and into the sand. Ahmed usually arranges the tea things, but he's taken leave, or run off. I can't be sure." Jane offered a faint smile. "Lemon or not, I'm more interested in something else that might have gone missing. Lady Helena, did your husband ever mention why he was funding the Blue Lotus expedition in the first place?" Helena blinked. "Oh, I suppose he wanted to leave a legacy, something scholarly and noble, a stone carving or some such in his name. He was always fascinated by Egyptian history, especially the dynasties associated with death rituals. Morbid man, really." Jane sipped her lukewarm tea thoughtfully. "Did he ever bring anything back from the dig sites? Artifacts? Documents?" Helena hesitated. "Yes, there was a journal. He kept it under lock. I was never allowed to read it. Said it had observations from Luxor." "I'd very much like to see it." "I wish you could," Helena said with a sigh. "But it vanished last week. William was furious." Just then, Jane noticed movement near the hedges. A young woman, dressed in a pale yellow dress, was trimming the bougainvillea vines with gloved hands, but her gaze kept flitting toward them. Her features were sharp and alert, not at all what one expected of a gardener. "Who's that?" Jane asked. "Oh, that's Miss Tilling, our new companion, supposedly sent from the British consul's office to assist while I deal with the stress of William's illness. She's frightfully efficient, and a bit too curious if you ask me." "Has she been here long?" 4 days. Jane's fingers drummed softly on the rim of her saucer. 4 days. That was just before the gala at the museum. Later that afternoon, she intercepted Miss Tilling as she emerged from the sunroom. The girl startled at Jane's sudden presence. "Miss Parsons," she said, smoothing her skirt, "can I help you?" "That depends. You seem quite interested in the Alverley household for someone assigned to fetch shawls and fluff pillows." Miss Tilling flushed, her green eyes narrowing. "I assure you I was instructed to keep Lady Alverley company, that is all." "Then you won't mind if I ask you a few questions?" I suppose not," she said stiffly, leading Jane to a shaded bench. "What do you wish to know?" Why did Lord Alverley need a companion for his wife suddenly? Was there concern for her safety? "I don't think so," she said, "but he seemed nervous. He received letters frequently, strange envelopes, Arabic script, sometimes with wax seals. Once I heard him muttering about someone called the Falcon." "The Falcon?" Miss Tilling nodded. "He said something about debts owed and that the Falcon always collects. He sounded frightened." Jane leaned back. "Did he ever mention Dr. Esteban Carvalho?" At that, Miss Tilling hesitated. "Only once. Said he had betrayed the trust of the expedition, that he was poking into things best left buried." That evening, Jane returned to the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities for a private meeting with Miles Everley. The main hall, now dim and echoing, had a ghostly beauty. The golden statues of gods and pharaohs loomed like sentinels. In the staff lounge, Miles poured her a glass of hibiscus tea. "Delighted you came," he said, handing her the cup, "although I do wish it were under less cursed circumstances." "I have questions," Jane said, seating herself at the work table scattered with excavation papers and maps. "You said Dr. Carvalho was supposed to return to Spain. Did he leave anything behind?" Miles raised a brow. "Curious that. He left in a hurry. His tent at the Luxor dig site was still set up last I heard, as though he vanished mid-breakfast." "And what was his role in the papyrus?" "He translated it," Miles said. "Brilliantly, I might add, but he kept his conclusions private. Said the message in the text was too dangerous to share. He got very mystical toward the end. Claimed the papyrus was not a scroll, but a map." Jane blinked. "A map? To a burial site, or perhaps a chamber. He was never clear. just said it held a great secret tied to the goddess Sekhmet and vengeance. She leaned forward. Was Lord Alverley aware? Miles hesitated. Yes, I believe he was financing Carvalho's deeper research, off the official records. Whatever they found, they kept quiet about it. Jane stood, her mind racing. As she turned to leave, Miles called after her. Miss Parsons, you should be careful. If what Carvalho believed was true, this isn't just a case of theft or deception. This is the kind of secret men have killed for, and will again. She paused at the door. I'm always careful, Mr. Everleigh, she said, especially when there's a map involved. That night, Jane sat at her writing desk in her hotel room and compiled a list of names. Lord William Alverley, poisoned or cursed, had secret dealings with Carvalho. Dr. Esteban Carvalho, vanished, may have found something beyond translation. Hamdi Saad saw a glowing-eyed man, still terrified. Miles Everleigh, charming but evasive, too willing to help. Miss Tilling, placed into household just before Papyrus went missing. Unverified background. The Falcon, mysterious name connected to debts and threats. She underlined the word map. Was the Blue Lotus papyrus a key to something hidden? Something buried beneath Egypt's sand for centuries? Outside her window, the wind carried the scent of lotus again. Jane rose and stepped onto the balcony. Below, a figure in white darted through the garden and disappeared into the night. Chapter 4. Death on the Alexandria. Express, the following morning, broke hot and windless, with the desert sun turning the Cairo sky into a sheet of white fire. At Ramses Station, a sea of humanity swirled through the marble arches, merchants balancing crates, tourists in pressed linen, soldiers in khaki, and veiled women whispering behind fans. Overhead, pigeons clattered against the rafters, and the scent of engine grease mingled with mint and smoke. Jane stood on platform 3, her eyes shielded by a wide-brimmed straw hat and a pair of tortoise-shell spectacles. She held a small leather suitcase and a copy of the Cairo Times folded twice. Her mood was alert, calm, and tinged with anticipation. The Alexandria Express was an iron leviathan of polished brass and deep green carriages. Bound for Egypt's northern coast, the train would pass through dusty towns, ancient farmland, and forgotten stretches of desert. Jane had no intention of completing the journey. She only needed to find one man. Dr. Esteban Carvalho had been spotted, or so whispered one of Helena's more socially ambitious dinner guests, in the port city of Rosetta, posing as a Turkish merchant. According to the same guest, he had purchased a forged travel permit and was trying to leave Egypt incognito. Jane wasn't sure if the story was true, but it was her best lead yet. She boarded Carriage C, a first-class compartment with dark velvet seats and brass luggage racks. The walls bore decorative panels of Nile reeds and ibis birds. A steward bowed and offered tea. Jane declined with a smile, removed her gloves and settled near the window. She had just opened her notebook when the door slid open. A woman entered. Tall, stylish and vaguely European, the woman wore a white silk blouse tucked into a pleated sky-blue skirt. A matching hat perched jauntily atop blonde curls, and she carried a silver cigarette case engraved with the letter A.S. Jane nodded politely. "Good morning." "Bonjour," the woman replied with a smile, settling into the seat across from her. "Such a journey, no?" "I hear the train stops for goats more often than for passengers." Jane chuckled. "If we're lucky, the goats will be less argumentative than some travellers I've known." The woman lit a cigarette with an ivory-handled lighter. "I am Sabine Delacroix, actress, or so they call me, though I suspect the critics have other names." "I've seen your name in the programmes. Paris, Monte Carlo, said Jane, introducing herself. "The same. I once played Cleopatra for an Egyptian prince. Terrible man. Fell asleep in the second act." Sabine gave a dramatic sigh and blew a perfect ring of smoke toward the ceiling. "But I forgive easily when diamonds are involved." They rode in pleasant silence for a while, watching the palm groves give way to dun-coloured fields and grazing camels. Vendors hawked sweet tea at rural stations, and children waved from donkey carts as the train rumbled past. At one such stop, Tanta, a heavy-set man with a briefcase, boarded the carriage. He wore a linen suit too tight for his girth and sweat-darkened underarms that betrayed the struggle of moving quickly in the heat. His hat sat crookedly on his head, and his eyes darted nervously as he settled into the seat beside Jane. "Terribly sorry," he wheezed. "Last-minute change in plans. Name's Mr. Gordon Styles, insurance evaluator. I travel the Empire inspecting damaged cargo." "A curious profession," Jane replied politely, noting the way his hands trembled as he reached for his handkerchief. She also noticed something else, the faint scent of lotus oil clinging to his collar. Her eyes narrowed. Sabine, too, seemed to sniff the air, but said nothing. Jane offered her hand. "Jane Parsons. I specialise in evaluating more delicate matters." Styles gave a weak chuckle. "Ah, the sort of thing no one wants written down. Yes, I imagine you've seen all kinds." "I have," Jane said mildly, "though not everyone who sits down across from me walks away smiling." Lunch was served in a narrow dining car with red velvet drapes and chipped silverware. Sabine held court over a plate of lentils and lemon chicken, while Mr. Styles fussed over a boiled egg as if it might explode. Jane, meanwhile, was making mental notes. The man was sweating profusely despite the fan overhead. He seemed paranoid, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the rear of the train. Twice he left the table to speak to someone Jane couldn't see, returning each time looking more unsettled. When they returned to the compartment, Jane noticed a faint trail of blue powder on the hem of Styles' trousers. The same powder had been found on the papyrus pedestal. Jane waited until he stepped out for the lavatory before opening his briefcase, which he had foolishly left unlocked beneath his seat. Inside were several official-looking forms, shipping documents, a stack of museum pamphlets, and a small leather-bound book marked in Spanish. Jane opened it. The handwriting was familiar. She had seen samples of Dr. Carvalho's letters at the museum archive. The notebook was filled with translations, symbols, and references to Sekhmet, the goddess of vengeance. One phrase, repeated again and again, "The curse will consume the unworthy." A sudden movement caught her attention. Someone was watching from the corridor. She closed the briefcase quickly and sat back just as Styles returned. "You look pale," he muttered, dabbing his neck. "So do you," Jane replied evenly. Just after 3 p.m, as the train passed a stretch of shimmering salt flats, Sabine suggested a game of cards. Styles declined, claiming a headache. Jane accepted, and the two women sat with a worn deck of tarot-style cards, laughing softly at each outlandish fortune Sabine invented. "Ah, the Queen of Cups," she declared at one point, laying down the card. "A woman of secrets, and always 2 steps ahead." "I prefer the Ace of Spades," Jane murmured. "It reminds me when to stay dangerous." Then came a sudden lurch. The train jerked as if struck, then slowed dramatically. Outside, dust clouds rose. Jane stood and opened the window just enough to peer out. A Bedouin camel cart had tipped near the tracks, and a small crowd was gathering. "We'll be stopped for 20 minutes, the steward announced. Styles, looking very ill, mumbled an excuse and left the compartment once more. Jane waited 10 seconds, then followed. She moved quickly through the train, slipping past the kitchen and storage carriages, past the murmuring steward compartments, until she reached the cargo coach at the rear. There she found Styles slumped in a corner, hand clutching his stomach, his eyes wide with terror. Jane dropped beside him, his lips were blue. "Tea!" he gasped. "The tea! Lotus!" Within moments he was dead. The police met the train in Damanhur, and the rest of the passengers were escorted off under the rising cloud of scandal. Jane remained behind, notebook in hand, as the local coroner examined the body. "It was a concentrated tincture of blue lotus oil," the coroner confirmed. "Highly toxic when distilled, not a common method." Sabine appeared at Jane's side. Curious, the man with secrets meets a poetic end, poisoned by perfume. Jane sighed. "He had Carvalho's notebook, and someone knew he planned to sell it." Sabine's voice dropped. "And that someone is still watching." "How do you know?" Sabine handed her a folded slip of paper. Jane unfolded it. One symbol had been inked carefully onto the parchment, a lotus flower with an eye inside. Chapter 5. An English Garden, a Deadly Game. It was about a fortnight after the harrowing train journey when Jane Parsons found herself once again surrounded by the clipped hedgerows and cool greys of an English summer. Though she had left the heat of Egypt behind, the mystery and the curse had followed her across continents. She stood now in the manicured gardens of Wendover Hall, the country estate of the Leighton family, nestled in the rolling hills of Surrey. The air smelled of roses and cut grass, and the sound of a nearby fountain mingled with birdsong. It was all very English, except, perhaps, for the presence of a ceremonial Egyptian Ushabti statue oddly placed beneath an elm tree beside the croquet set. Jane had come to Wendover at the behest of Lady Cecily Leighton, one of the key sponsors of the Cairo exhibition and a long-time acquaintance of the Alverleys. Her connection to the Blue Lotus papyrus was no secret, nor was her notoriously meddlesome interest in esoteric matters, which she pursued with the fervour of a spiritualist. Lady Cecily had written urgently from Wendover. "My dear Jane, I believe the danger is not past. There are signs, portents, and last night someone rifled through my Egyptian collection. Please come discreetly. Yours in haste, Cecily." Now Jane observed the players on the lawn, a tableau as charming as it was suspicious. Lady Cecily herself, tall, wiry, and wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth, moved about the croquet course in a swirl of ivory fabric, pontificating about ley lines and the lost wisdom of the Nile. Nearby, Colonel Archibald Mayhew, a retired army man with a walrus moustache, grunted as he lined up his shot. At the far end, lounging beneath a striped umbrella, sat Miss Lila Harrow, Cecily's goddaughter, a fashionable and rather bored-looking woman with marcelled hair and a fondness for gin at noon. And standing behind the lemonade table, dressed far too neatly for a simple servant, was Mr. Rafiq Hassan, Cecily's Egyptian cultural adviser, whom Jane immediately suspected of being more than a curator of dusty trinkets. Lady Cecily spotted her and waved with unmistakable urgency. "Jane, my dear, come at once. I've just had a most disturbing vision about Sekhmet." Jane crossed the lawn, politely dodging an errant croquet ball. "Before we get to visions, Lady Cecily, perhaps we could start with last night's incident. What exactly happened?" Cecily led her to a bench beneath a willow tree and lowered her voice dramatically. "At precisely 2:30 in the morning, I awoke from a dream in which a blue lotus turned to blood in my hands. I took this as a sign and went down to the library. There, I discovered that my cabinet, the one containing my collection of Egyptian tokens, had been opened." "Was it broken into?" "Number. The lock was picked, and one item was missing." Jane took out her notebook. "What item?" "A carved pendant, obsidian in the shape of the Eye of Ra. I purchased it in Cairo years ago. but Rafiq believes it may have come from the same temple complex as the blue Lotus papyrus. Jane frowned. Could you describe it in detail? Certainly. It had an inscription on the back, very faint. Rafiq translated it last year. Something about the watcher in the dark and the guardian of the mouth of stone. She fluttered her fingers. Quite ominous, really. And who knew it was here? Oh, only Rafiq, Lila, and perhaps Archibald. But he thinks hieroglyphs are just fancy bird scratchings. Jane glanced across the lawn. I'd like to speak to Mr. Hassan, if I may. Mr. Rafiq Hassan was smooth, impeccably dressed, and wore a calm expression honed through years of diplomacy. He greeted Jane with a slight bow. Miss Parsons, he said, Lady Cecily speaks very highly of you, though I confess she also told me last week she had conversed with a spirit through a mirror, so I take her assessments with discretion. I'm looking into the theft of the obsidian pendant, Jane said evenly, and into the papyrus that vanished from the Cairo museum. You were involved with both, I believe. I assisted with cataloguing Lady Cecily's Egyptian artefacts. Yes, I was also present when the blue Lotus papyrus was removed from the temple near Luxor. Removed, not excavated? He met her gaze. There was no formal excavation. The scroll was discovered by Dr. Carvalho and Lord Alverley in what was technically an unregistered dig. The papyrus chamber was located beneath a collapsed shrine, one said to be cursed. Jane arched a brow. And you believe in such things? I believe that belief itself is powerful, Miss Parsons, enough to drive men mad. She studied him. And what of the Eye of Ra pendant? He hesitated, then said quietly, It was not meant to be disturbed. That symbol, combined with the papyrus, points to a location, a site marked in myth, a burial chamber known as the Mouth of Stone. Let me guess, Jane said dryly, guarded by the goddess of vengeance. Sekhmet, Rafiq said gravely, lion-headed, wrathful and patient. The ancient texts say she sleeps until the unworthy call her name. Those who awaken her face, purification. And who do you think stole the pendant? I cannot say, but I will tell you this. He glanced at the house. 2 days ago, I found a footprint in the library, not a shoe, a bare footprint, in ash. Later that afternoon, Jane wandered through the manor's Egyptian room, a peculiar chamber Lady Cecily had designed herself. Papyrus scroll facsimiles lined the walls. The ceiling was painted with stars. In one corner, a full-size replica of a burial mask grinned out from behind glass. Jane's eyes narrowed. One display case, empty now, bore the tag, Obsidian Amulet, Eye of Ra. She turned and nearly walked into Miss Lila Harrow, who was nursing a tumbler of something fragrant and unnaturally pink. You're the detective, Lila said flatly. Cecily's had half the house in a panic with her talk of curses and pharaohs. Did you happen to be in the library the night of the theft? Lila tilted her head. Number I was on the veranda with a rather attractive lieutenant from Aldershot. We were comparing military strategies. Jane smiled faintly. And your opinion on the curse? Lila laughed. The only curse in this house is Cecily's cooking. But I will say this, I saw Mr. Hassan and Archibald arguing that evening over something to do with Egypt and financing. I didn't stay to eavesdrop, it was boring. Thank you, Jane said. Oh, and Jane, Lila added with a sly smile, if you find the Eye of Ra, do let me borrow it. I hear obsidian brings out the blue in one's eyes. That evening, the household gathered for an impromptu parlour game of clues and curses, a theatrical tradition of the Leighton estate. Guests took on roles and acted out mock mysteries with silly accents, plastic daggers, and far too much wine. Jane, despite herself, was amused. Cecily played an over-dramatic priestess. Archibald donned a fez. Lila played a ghost with a flask hidden in her veil. Even Rafik took part, as a cursed pharaoh. But partway through the game, the lights flickered, the gramophone needle scratched, and the laughter died. From the hallway came a sound, glass shattering. Jane rose immediately. They followed the noise to the library. The case that once held the Eye of Ra label had been smashed. The empty display card was missing, and on the floor lay something strange, a crumpled piece of parchment, with a symbol of a lotus drawn in ash. Next to it, a small drop of blood. Chapter 6. The Night of the Blue Lotus. The library at Wendover Hall stood in eerie silence. The broken glass crunched under Jane's heels as she moved carefully toward the shattered display case. The guests from the parlour game hovered in the doorway, wine-fueled laughter now transformed into hushed murmurs and alarm. She knelt beside the parchment bearing the lotus drawn in ash. Her gloved fingers touched the blood droplet near it, not fresh, but not yet dry. She turned sharply to the others. "Who left the parlour first?" she demanded. There was a pause. Then Lila raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "Mr. Hassan stepped away to fetch more wine, I believe." All eyes turned, but Rafik was gone. Jane stood at once. "Cecily, lock the doors. Colonel, check the grounds. Lila, you're with me." They found Rafik Hassan in the gallery, standing before a stained glass window depicting Saint George slaying the dragon. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his left hand bore a freshly wrapped bandage, blood seeping through the cloth. When he saw them approach, he did not flinch. "I did not take the pendant," he said calmly. Jane folded her arms. "You left a lotus symbol drawn in ash beside a drop of your own blood. If that's your way of declaring innocence, it's a very theatrical one." "I was trying to warn you," he said, his voice low. "The Eye of Ra has been taken by someone who doesn't understand its purpose. I came in to check the case and found it already broken. I cut myself on the glass." "You didn't think to mention it?" "I wasn't sure who I could trust," he said, glancing at Lila, who was now lighting a cigarette and looking utterly bored. "I thought it best to remain silent until I knew where your loyalties lay." Jane studied him, trying to read the truth between his words. There was something resolute in his gaze, but also fear. "Then tell me now," she said. "Who are you really, Mr. Hassan?" He hesitated. "My real name is Rafik El-Masri. I was once a professor at Cairo University, specializing in religious symbology. I was dismissed after I published a paper on the Sekhmet tablets, texts that many considered myth. It was Lord Alverley who funded my research after that, but he wasn't interested in knowledge. He wanted access. He wanted to find the mouth of stone." Jane's voice was quiet. "And what is it exactly?" "A hidden tomb, forgotten even by Egyptian scribes, supposedly sealed in the 18th dynasty after a priest betrayed Sekhmet's temple. It's said the tomb contains writings, forbidden writings, meant to summon or suppress divine judgment. Carvalho believed the Blue Lotus papyrus was a guide to its location." "And now it's gone," Jane murmured. "Yes, and someone is killing to cover its trail." The next day brought grim news. At dawn, a messenger arrived from London bearing a telegram. "Body recovered near Chiswick Wharf, identified as Dr. Esteban Carvalho. Cause of death, drowning. Authorities suspect foul play. Papers missing. Scotland Yard." Jane stared at the message. Carvalho, the one man who could have deciphered the scroll fully, was silenced. Another link in the chain broken. But why drown him? She turned the question over in her mind as she walked through the Wendover gardens, morning mist curling around the rose bushes. The dew clung to her skirt hem. From somewhere down the path came a faint tinkling. A piano. Someone was playing Debussy unevenly. Following the sound, she arrived at a side parlour. Inside, Lila sat at the piano, a cigarette dangling from her lips, tapping out the melody of Clair de Lune. "Morning," she said without turning. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I've just read of a man's death." "Cairo or England?" "England." Lila paused, letting a dissonant chord ring out. "You know, Cecily has always had a soft spot for the occult, but I think this whole thing has gone too far. She's been speaking to mirrors again." Jane sat in the armchair by the window. "Where were you when Carvalho died?" Lila smiled coldly. "You're assuming I knew him." "You didn't deny it." She closed the piano lid with a snap. "Carvalho once showed me the scroll, said the lotus wasn't just symbolic. It represented a root and a key. He told me the Eye of Ra pendant fit into a stone relief in a tomb somewhere near the Valley of the Kings. Said when both were placed together, something would open." "Did you believe him?" "I believe in greed. Carvalho was scared, said someone was following him. He asked me to hide the pendant." Jane's eyes narrowed. "So you have it?" Lila gave her a thin smile. "Not any more." That night, Lady Cecily hosted a dinner, a subdued affair despite the best attempts at light conversation. Rafiq remained silent. Lila drank heavily. The Colonel was missing, allegedly under the weather. Jane excused herself early and returned to the Egyptian room. Something had been nagging at her, a small detail from Rafiq's story. She examined the wall behind the display cabinet, running her fingers along the carvings. A faint seam. She pressed against it. With a soft groan, a panel slid open, revealing a hollow cavity behind the bookshelf. Inside was a small compartment, empty save for a burnt piece of parchment and the faint smell of lotus oil. She took out the scrap. The edges were blackened, but the centre was intact. It showed a map, drawn in symbols, part of the Nile, a series of coordinates, and the unmistakable Eye of Ra. Beneath it, one word in Carvalho's handwriting: Wickham. Jane's breath caught. Wickham Abbey, the crumbling monastery turned private estate, half forgotten and sealed for decades. It had once been owned by a mysterious collector known to fund occult expeditions. It was in Wiltshire, 2 hours from Wendover, and it might be the final resting place of the missing papyrus. Later, in her room, Jane locked the door and sat at the writing desk. She penned 2 letters, one to Inspector Price at Scotland Yard, requesting background on Colonel Mayhew, and another to Helena Alverley, asking whether her husband had ever visited Wickham before his illness. As she sealed the envelopes, something fluttered down from her bookshelf. She turned sharply. There, lying on the floor, was a blue lotus petal, but there were no fresh flowers in her room. She picked it up slowly, and on her desk, scrawled in ash, she hadn't seen it before, was a single word: return. Chapter 7. The Curse Revealed. The road to Wickham Abbey twisted through a cold morning fog, past empty fields and hedgerows heavy with dew. Once a medieval monastery, the estate had long since been abandoned, shuttered after a fire in the 1870s. But according to Jane's sources, it had been quietly purchased 5 years earlier by a shell foundation backed by Lord William Alverley. Jane sat in the back of the hired motor car, wool coat buttoned high, her notebook in her lap. Every line, every question, every lie traced back to this place. The missing papyrus, the stolen pendant, the trail of deaths, Carvalho, Styles and others, all orbited this unassuming ruin like planets around a dying sun. She wasn't alone. Inspector Price of Scotland Yard sat beside her. His telegram had arrived the day before. Confirmed, Colonel Archibald Mayhew once served in Egypt under false identity. disgraced for smuggling antiquities, disappeared in 1902, presumed dead, re-emerged in London circles under assumed name. Jane had read the message 3 times, so that was why the good colonel had vanished from Wendover after the library incident. He was no war hero. He was a ghost in uniform. Now, as the car rolled to a stop before the wrought-iron gates of Wickham Abbey, Inspector Price grunted. "Cheerful place," he muttered. "Looks like a monastery Dracula rejected." "Perfect for a secret tomb," Jane replied and stepped out. Inside, the abbey was cold, damp and silent. Vines snaked along the stone floors, glass crunched underfoot. The chapel roof had caved in years ago, but the crypt beneath remained accessible, locked behind a rusted iron gate. Jane lit a lantern. They descended the steps together, the air thick with mildew and something else, a faint floral note. Not jasmine, not rose, lotus. Beneath the chapel, the crypt opened into a wide pillared chamber, clearly renovated. Carvings lined the walls, Egyptian motifs, a grotesque imitation of a pharaoh's tomb built in an English abbey. In the centre of the chamber stood an alabaster altar, and upon it, illuminated by the flicker of flame, was the blue lotus papyrus, whole, unscathed, and beside it the Eye of Ra pendant nested in a carved depression. Jane stepped forward. "Cavallo was right," she murmured. "The scroll is a map, and the pendant is the key." "It's also bait," said a voice behind her. She turned. From the shadows stepped Colonel Archibald Mayhew, no longer in tweed, but in a ceremonial robe lined with gold thread, stolen from some long-forgotten temple. His eyes gleamed. In one hand he held a pistol, in the other a vial of blue lotus oil, stoppered but uncorked. "Back away from the altar," he said, slowly. Price stepped forward. "Mayhew, or whatever your name is, this is over. Scotland Yard has your file. We know everything." Mayhew laughed. Do you? Do you know what I found beneath Luxor in 1902? Do you know the real power hidden in these scrolls? This isn't about theft. This is about ascension." Jane tilted her head. "So you're not just a smuggler. You're a fanatic." He sneered. "I'm a keeper. The mouth of stone exists. Carvalho found the directions. I completed them. That tomb will open for the chosen and purge the rest." Price raised his pistol, but Mayhew was faster. A gunshot rang out, but it went wild. Jane had hurled the lantern. It shattered at Mayhew's feet, blue lotus oil catching fire. Flames licked upward, not quite reaching him, but startling him enough for Inspector Price to tackle him to the ground. The pistol skidded away. Jane rushed forward, grabbed the papyrus and pendant, and stepped back as the flames rose. Mayhew howled. "Fools! You don't understand what you've unleashed." But it was over. 2 days later, Wendover Hall. The household gathered in the drawing-room. Lady Cecily, Lila, Rafik and Helena, newly arrived with news that Lord Alverley's health was finally improving. Jane, now in her travelling coat, stood near the fireplace. "I believe," she began, "it's time we untangled this web." They leaned forward, drawn as always to her crisp voice and disarming logic. The Blue Lotus papyrus was never cursed. It was part of a map, a guide to a forgotten tomb believed to contain writings from the Sekhmet priesthood. Carvalho and Lord Alverley discovered it, but Carvalho feared what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands, so he tried to hide it. And the pendant key. Lila raised an eyebrow. "And I helped him, but someone betrayed us." "Indeed," Jane said. "Colonel Mayhew, or rather Edward Braithwaite, a former looter, faked his identity and attached himself to Cecily's circle, waiting for the right moment. He killed Styles to retrieve Cavallo's notebook. Then he lured Cavallo to London and drowned him." Helena covered her mouth. "My God!" He knew Lady Cecily owned the Eye of Ra pendant and used the Wendover gathering to steal it. "Why the lotus oil?" Cecily asked. "Because it was symbolic, the scent of the goddess, but also deadly when refined. He used it to poison Styles and nearly used it again on us in the crypt." Rafik exhaled. "And the tomb?" "Real," Jane said, "but it will remain sealed. The British Museum has agreed to return the scroll to Egypt under new oversight. Rafik will assist with the restoration." There was a quiet murmur of relief. Lila raised her glass. "To Jane Parsons, who can outwit pharaohs, fanatics, and dinner guests in one breath." Jane gave a modest nod. "I only follow the truth where it leads." Epilogue. Cairo, 1 month later. Back in Egypt, the sun dipped low over the Nile. Jane sat on the rooftop terrace of the Shepherd's Hotel, a glass of lemon mint tea in hand, watching the city shimmer in the dying light. Across from her, Rafik laid down the final parchment scroll for cataloguing. "I've heard a rumour," he said, "that they're naming the exhibit after you." Jane groaned. "I certainly hope not. The Jane Parsons wing of ancient vengeance doesn't have much ring to it." He smiled. "What will you do next?" "I've been invited to investigate a missing Fabergé egg in Vienna," she said. "Or perhaps I'll go sailing in the Aegean." A waiter passed with a tray of lotus-scented perfume bottles. Jane glanced at them, then looked away. "I think I've had enough of curses for one lifetime,"